So what I want to do now is move into a discussion of Heidegger's Being and Time. This is his magnum opus, Being and Time. It's his first great book, and it was published in 1927, famously, as everyone knows. And it's a big, hefty tome, so it will take us some time to get through, as was the case with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, another one of these giant tomes of German philosophy that inaugurates the beginnings of the end of the metaphysical age. So the metaphysical age in philosophy, then, is the epoch that extends more or less from Plato to Husserl, or from Plato to Heidegger, or from Plato to Nietzsche, depending on where you want to draw the line, in which being is understood as objectivity. The being of objects is that they have objectivity and that there's a realm of subjects who is capable of apprehending the truth of these objects. And it presupposes that the objective nature of being is that there is an ontological structure of truth. Truth is not something relative, it's absolute, it's out there. All you as a subject have to do is to find it, find this truth, and conform to it. And so we have the primary thing that governs this age is the correspondence theory of truth, in which truth is a matter not of making, but of matching. The mind matches the ideas. Truth is the agreement of knowledge with objects, basically, the agreement of concepts with objects. And so there's a correspondence theory of truth that presupposes that there's this ingrained ontological structure of what truth is that's there, that's waiting for the human mind to discover it, or the individual knower who is on his quest. And knowledge is an initiatory process through the study of texts or through the tutelage of a master or a teacher of some sort, Socrates teaching Plato, for example, who initiates one into what the nature of this truth is, and the mind simply conforms to it. So it's an absolutely objective idea about what truth is. That's the metaphysical age. The metaphysical age ends with Heidegger, more or less, and since Heidegger, we've been living in the post-metaphysical age, in which we have, as the philosopher Gianni Vattimo puts it, a realm or a time in which truth is weak. We have weak truths or soft truths, and being takes on a constitutive structure of weakening in this age, primarily due to the conflict of interpretations. Now, we have truth is not a matter of matching anymore, it's a matter of making. Truth is a knowledge game. It's a hermeneutics game in which different thought systems, different worldviews have different rules, and that can be said to be true, that is consistent with each particular system. You can't apply the rules of basketball to baseball without violating the rules of basketball. It doesn't work that way. You have to stick with the rules of each particular game, and as a result of that, there can be no, in such a post-metaphysical age, there can be no idea of an absolute truth to which one person has access or one culture has correct access, and which can therefore be used to fuel fundamentalisms and violence to get others to conform to this. That age is over with, and so that's the time that we're living in here, and that is what Being in Time, the appearance of it in 1927 begins to signify the beginnings of the dissolution of being, the weakening of being, and the beginnings of the arrival of soft ontologies. Soft, you can think of Vattimo's idea of soft ontologies versus the rigid ontologies of the metaphysical age, almost like the difference between an erect phallus and a flaccid one. The erect phallus of the Western tradition of truth it's not quite so confident anymore, is it? There's a flaccidness about it now. So it doesn't have this kind of absolute rigid nature to it anymore. It has to be worked with. So moving in then directly to Being in Time, what I want to do is skip the introduction. I agree with Hubert Dreyfus that the introduction should be skipped by all first comers. It was written after the book was completed anyway, and it's the hardest part of the book to understand, and it's just a waste of time to sit and struggle with it. You need to get right into the text itself, which begins with part one, the interpretation of Dasein in terms of temporality, and the explication of time as the transcendental horizon for the question of being. So being is going to be all about time in this book. Being will be time. There will be three different modes of being, as we'll see, and there'll be three different kinds of time that correspond to these three different modes of being. Division 1, the preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein. And so the first chapter then is headed, just gives us the exposition of the task of a preparatory analysis of Dasein. And the first point that he makes in the theme of the analytic of Dasein is this differentiation, this distinction between existentia and existenz. These are two very different things. And in this second paragraph here, where he talks about, where he says that the essence of Dasein, the Wesen of Dasein, lies in its Zu-Sein, in its to be aspect, and not in its existential, or not in its essence. Is that it's its existence. Basically, existenz is its essence, which is to say we have no essence, really. We are what we do. Our custom, Dasein is always already involved in a world. It's always engaged in a task, and that basically is our nature. There is no fundamental essence to it, in contrast to the mode of being which Heidegger calls Vorhandenheit. So we have three different modes of being here: Vorhandenheit, Zuhandenheit, and Dasein. The mode that is proper to Dasein is Existenz, which is a term that Heidegger borrows from Karl Jaspers. It means being in the world in an active and engaged way, performing your tasks with a pre-ontological understanding of them, which simply means that you know what you're supposed to do without having to philosophically analyze it. You're already in a world, always, already. But the existentia idea, that there's some sort of an essence, that there is no essence to being beyond that, or no essence rather to Dasein beyond doing, beyond being in a culture, doing and engaging in tasks and doing things and bringing a world into being. Whereas existentia is the essence of something that is in the mode of being that's understood proper to Vorhandenheit, or presence at hand, as it's translated. The key part of Vorhandenheit is the German prefix there, vor, for, which means prior to. Vorhandenheit is the mode, then, of being as it has been understood since Plato, all the way down to Husserl, in which we have theoretical entities that simply exist in an objective way as self-sufficient entities, like, let's say, Leibniz's monads, or the traditional Cartesian cogito, the self as a thinking substance that is a self-sufficient entity. And it's basically reified as a thing here. And it's the mode of the existence of entities as substances with attributes. Attributes are part of these substances, and they are essentially de-worlded, as Heidegger has put it in some of his earlier lectures prior to this. These entities are de-worlded. They're not embedded in a world. They kind of exist in this abstract phase space, and their essence is to simply is being in terms of present at hand as theoretical entities. They're self-sufficient and they have no need of a world. It's almost just like they're disembodied intelligences hovering above the world. This has been the understanding of being since Plato, being as objectivity, a realm of absolute subjects, human subjects, reified as things, as substances, whether we're talking about the Cartesian cogito or the Kantian transcendental unity of apperception, beholding a realm of absolute objects that are objective, in which the relationship of the subject to the object is a correspondence theory of truth, in which the subject has to conform to the object, or as in Kant, as we have seen in my previous Kant videos, in which the object has to mercilessly conform to the tyranny of the subject, and the categories, the a priori Kantian categories that are applied to the object and that make the object. So we've already seen in Kant, with his idea of the transcendental unity of apperception, which is simply the I, Kant's fancy word for the cogito, which is the I as the capacity of conferring formal unity on the synthetic manifold of the representations that appear to the subject from the outer world. And in the outer world we have, rather the mind bringing to experience the a priori categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality, and their subcategories which make scientific knowledge about the world possible. That's the transcendental object, object X, that is in the mode of Vorhandenheit, existentia. And it's completely different from Dasein. Dasein for Heidegger, Heidegger in the second paragraph here of Being and Time is turning the entire history of metaphysics upside down. And he's doing that specifically by taking the subject and embedding him back into the world, into the concrete world. Dasein's nature is existenz, and existenz means primarily being in the world. That's the key thing about, that's what he says basically the a priori structure of Dasein is, being in a world. To be in a world is to be engaged in, always already engaged in tasks in a world. And so he's going to take the subject and embed him back into the world. For he doesn't use the word, the cogito, or any kind of word for the subject or the self. Because for him, Dasein is not only the human world, but it is self plus world. Self plus world together as a unit, engaged and embedded in a particular being world. That's the being here that he is saying in this second paragraph that cannot be understood as being present at hand, as has been the case hitherto in philosophy. And the result of that has been to reify that understanding of understanding the subject as Vorhandenheit has been to reify the subject, to turn it into a thing that can be thought to exist completely independently of the world, almost like a disembodied soul. The Cartesian cogito is a retrieval of the Gnostic myth of the disembodied self that mistrusts the world and exists in an abstract a priori phase space as though it were hovering above the earth and not part of what's going on in it. For Heidegger, we can't be apart from the system that we're studying. We're always already engaged in it. We're interlocked in it, and we've been doing it long before the mind comes along to begin to analyze and think about it. We have a pre-ontological understanding of our text, of what it is that we're doing. And so this is how he starts out. And he says one of the main things about Dasein then is that its structure is linked with its structure is authenticity versus inauthenticity. And part of its inauthenticity is its average everydayness. There's an aspect to Dasein which is its average everydayness. It's always involved in tasks, and it tends to dissipate its life tasks through its thrownness into a particular place and time. And this is its averageness, its average everydayness. And it's linked with inauthenticity. And he says that the categories then, if you think of the Kantian categories that we were just talking about, are what apply to existentia, to objects understood as self-sufficient entities, as abstract substances, whereas for the characteristic structures of Dasein are not going to be categories, they're going to be what he calls existentialia. And existentialia are simply things like the thrownness of Dasein, or care, or concern, or these are the various structures that are going to be part of Dasein in terms of its existentialia. Then to conclude this opening section, there's another section where he talks about how the ancients reified the self, how the self since Descartes as a cogito has been reified, and this is a mistake. And he's also reacting, of course, against Husserl with the transcendental ego, and Husserl's idea of the transcendental ego as an entity that is separate from everything that it looks at. And out in the world we see all these objects that are separate from each other. We have three modes of being, and in addition to Dasein on the one hand, the human mode of being in the world, and a Vorhandenheit, we also have Zuhandenheit, which is the mode of being in the world for technology, for equipment, which is a mode of being in the world in which everything presupposes, the equipmental world, the technological world presupposes everything else. Each thing is part of a kind of web of interreferentiality, of contextuality, such that one object cannot be understood apart from any other object. This pen, for example, is part of a world that presupposes this desk and this chair and this table and the very concept of learning and area dish. Everything sort of presupposes everything else. And these objects are not abstract. They don't exist like still life paintings or Cartesian mathematically analyzed grids in abstract phase space. They don't exist that way in the real world. They're part of a concrete world that gives them, through interreferentiality, that gives them their intelligibility, their being. So those are the three modes of being, and there will be three modes of temporality that correspond to that. The clock time will correspond to Vorhandenheit. Pragmatic time then will correspond to Zuhandenheit, and then primordial time will correspond to Dasein, which is something we'll get into. Then he finishes this chapter with a note. Largely, the approach of the early Heidegger is a synchronic approach. It's not diachronic yet. The later Heidegger, after the turn, after 1930 or so, is concerned with being as a sort of series of historical manifestations of these different epochs of being. And in each, the main concern becomes ereigness, the idea of being as an event that happens, that is part of the destiny of each epoch, that speaks to us and tells us how to understand how things will be in that particular epoch. But back during the period of being in time, he treats being as though it had a synchronic structure. Dasein has a synchronic structure, but in this final part, he does note that primitive Dasein, he's not talking about primitive Dasein, what Gebser would call the magical consciousness structure. Primitive Dasein is something different. So we could say that primitive Dasein is different from mythical Dasein, which would correspond to Gebser's magical consciousness structure and the mythical consciousness structure. And the type of Dasein that he's really talking about in terms of average everydayness is the Dasein of Gebser's mental consciousness structure, which is to say the Dasein of European thought and civilization, the highly differentiated mode of average everydayness.